World overview of philosophy.
Hi everyone! Next up is Aristotle, whom we have seen in the previous lesson.
Yeah, Aristotle was a student from Macedonia, when Plato was preoccupied with educating the young king of Syracuse.
So, he didn't feel very close to Plato.
Furthermore, he was critical of the old Plato. He was discriminated against as a Macedonian of northern barbarian, but he was much more modern than the Greeks. Indeed, he respected mythology, but just because he regarded it as a common culture to unite folk. He no longer believed in earth motherism and Orphism.
He was so brilliant that he disliked the divine theories of Plato.
He denied it logically, and constructed a grand system to replace it, metaphysics.
Wow, his approach was completely different from the previous philosophers. So, the next. To contradicting problem that goodness is knowledge but cannot be taught, Plato drew on Orphism to develop an amnesis theory that we already know goodness before birthing heaven and just recall it by some cue on earth.
Hence, Plato generalized the theory to argue that we perceive things by recalling their heavenly archetypes, ideas. In addition, he insisted that the more things resemble the idea, the better.
But do ideas really exist?
The young Aristotle did not simply doubt that, but demonstrated that ideas could not exist. According to him, for example, if Socrates resembles the idea of humans, then there must be another idea of humanity, or the third idea of humanity, common to Socrates and the idea of humans. If so, they would need to further the higher idea to unify them. This logic leads to an infinite regress. This is called the third man argument.
A wrong conclusion proves that the first premise is wrong.
Without getting into such complicated arguments, we can immediately see the unreasonableness of the idea theory. Socrates should share not only the idea of humans, but also the idea of the Greeks, the idea of the soldiers, and even the idea of Socrates himself. Thus, one thing contains many ideas. Then, the ideas in heaven would be far more numerous than the things in this world.
Heaven is too crowded.
In addition, Plato's idea theory created many new problems. Do bad things also have their ideas? How about lack or emptiness?
Plato's idea theory is too troublesome. So, the next.
In the first place, if not an Orphic and not adhering to the anamnesis theory, there is no need to assume heaven. So, Aristotle stripped the goodness out of ideas, and called them merely looks or eidoi. Namely, a thing in the world is formed by a combination of eule or the material, and eidos or the look.
Ironically, Aristotle purified the useless religious overtones of Plato's theory.
In addition, he found that what does not exist even as a human cannot become a soldier. Only what has already consisted as a human by a combination of the material and the look can be a soldier. That means, the composite is again the material for the look of a soldier. Thus, a composite takes a further look, and repeats the joining as a higher material.
One thing is covered with many layers of eidos.
However, plural eidoi have the proper order of high and low. To research this problem, he used the parallels of reality, knowledge, and language. The relation in reality between material and look is the same as between attention and judgment in knowledge, and between subject and predicate in language. When we say A is B, A is material, attention, and subject, while B is look, judgment, and predicate.
That's an amazing discovery.
When A is B, A is an entity or species, while B is a genus. For example, Snoopy is a beagle. At this time, Snoopy is an entity, while beagle is a genus. However, when saying beagle is dog, beagle is a species, and dog is a genus. Furthermore, when saying dog is animal, dog is now a species, and animal is a genus.
Can we trace this chain to any length?
It's not so long. Animal is living thing. Living thing is thing. Thing is entity. That's about it.
We are back to the beginning.
The larger genus is in fact, rather the lower eidos. So, the material itself is the end. However, interestingly, several of the last eidoi are closest to the material. Not only entity, but also quantity, quality, relative, place, time, position, condition, action, and affection. For example, dog is entity, only one is quantity, smart is quality, Charlie's is relative, on the roof of the doghouse is place, always is time, lying is position, with dream is condition, sleep is action, and suffering from claustrophobia is affection. These 10 lowest eidoi are called categoriae.
Why are there so many?
The raw eule or the material itself before any eidoi should be called only totati, so it is on, or protewushia. It is spoken of in many different ways. Conversely, it is a polyhedron from the beginning, although we can focus on only one aspect at a time. Aristotle called the transcendental relation of it, pros hen.
The things themselves, before we talk about them, namely reality, are polyhedra. We learned that in the first lecture. So, the next.
Protewushia is spoken of in many ways. That is not only due to the difference in categories. In the same categoria, it may change. For example, a green apple turns red. Thus, change rather occurs only at the same hierarchical level, within the same categoria. Even keeping the same eidos may be retaking it, so a sort of change. Therefore, Aristotle thought that being is always becoming.
To consider existence, he brought the timeline into it.
He found that change is just a transformation of the eidos, and the material remains without any change. The apple as material is always the same, but it changes only the eidoi, green to red. In short, we call change, when keeping the material, it replaces only the combination with the eidoi.
True, if a little pumpkin turns into a big carriage, that is magic. But if the witch has just brought another carriage, that is not.
Considering it with the timeline, it has three modes: the condition before becoming, in becoming, and after becoming. He called each of them dunamis, energeia, and entelecheia, id est, being possible, working, and on the goal. For example, a developed land is a residential area as dunamis, a house constructing site is a residential area as energeia, and a town with many houses is a residential area as entelecheia.
Aha, though these are called the same, the states are quite different.
These are also transformations of eidoi. However, simply putting a blueprint on lumber does not make a house. For a material to take a new eidos, an agent is needed. However, will carpenters begin to work only if they have lumber and a blueprint? They probably would not work without the client, and the client also does not order them a house without a plan to live there. Thus, a change needs not only the material and the new eidos, but also the agent cause and the purpose cause. This is Aristotle's four causes theory. If any of these four are missing, no change will occur.
I wonder, because I don't have the will to stop eating sweets, so I can't lose weight. So, the next.
Looking at the world from a generation perspective, agent causes and purpose causes form a large causality chain. When we trace it back to the beginning, we will reach the arche.
I understand the reasoning, but can we do such great research?
So, let's think logically. The first should be something that moves the others, but is not moved by anything. We do not know what it is, but it should be what we could call nothing but God.
I see.
The next is what is moved by it, but does not move.
Moved, but does not move, that's a contradiction.
How about rotation? Influenced by the astronomer Eudoxus in the Academy, during Plato's absence, Aristotle had an astronomical view of the world. So he thought, the immovable North Star is the arche of the world, followed by the stars, planets, and the moon. And these move things on Earth.
This theory would be the rationale behind astrology.
Stars are made of ether, or explicit material, while things on Earth are made of fire, air, water, and mud. However, they are initially the material itself or the proteousia, and added agent causes of hot or cold, and purpose causes of dry or wet, so that it can show different eidoi.
Then, if we could manipulate it properly, we could change it into another eidos, even gold. The theory would also develop alchemy.
Mineral, plants, animals, even humans, everything on Earth is in fact made by mixing these four materials. However, although influenced by stars, as well as other things on Earth, we humans only have another agent cause, our souls. On the other hand, our purpose cause is everlasting happiness. It is realized by virtue that never wavers even in any trouble.
In short, the agent causes our souls, the material causes our lives, the eidos causes virtue, and the purpose causes happiness.
Since humans are social animals who interact with each other, the eidos of virtue that we humans should acquire is prepared by society as habits, especially its laws. But how should we make them? Aristotle thought that dictatorships tend to run away, and democracies tend to go haywire, so republics run by the limited middle-class citizens would be better. Although mythology is nothing more than fiction, when we citizens recognize it repeatedly with rituals and plays, it works as our collective soul or the social agent causes that make us consider proper habits and laws.
Wow! For Aristotle, human habits and laws, as well as myths and dramas, all make sense.
He called nature's chain unity, Scala Naturae, or stairs of nature, and he expressed that with the words, nature abhors a vacuum, and nature does nothing in vain. This means, the universe is a giant clockwork without gaps and waste. His worldview anticipated modern ecological thinking.
So, the next.
As the most talented lecturer in the academy, Aristotle was expected to be its next master. However, after Plato died in 347 BC, Plato's nephew took over the academy. This was because he criticized Plato's theory, and was a Macedonian regarded as a barbarian by the Athenians. Aristotle at 37 left the academy.
They were nasty people.
But after that, he was invited by his native Macedonia to be a tutor for Prince Alexander. When Alexander became the king in 336 BC, and conquered Athens, he built a new school in the southeast of Athens, the Lyceum, and gifted it to his master Aristotle at 49. In addition to his original research, advanced academic and practical information from Egypt and Persia that Alexander had gained during his campaigns made his Lyceum a center of studies superior to the academy.
Look, we never know what fate holds.
The same goes for him. When Alexander the Great died in 323 BC, the Athenians rose against Macedonia, and Aristotle had to flee. Thus, most of his manuscripts were also lost, and Aristotle died in exile in 322 BC, at 62.
No wonder Greece was failing.
His surviving manuscripts were collated, around 30 BC. They were at most, just 2/3 of his notes, but covering everything from logic to drama. At that time, the editor put treatises on existence, form, and generation, into a book, the next of the band of studies of physics or nature, so they were called metaphysica.
Initially, Meta did not mean the higher.
Conspiracies and assassinations were rampant in the Roman Empire, so the Stoics sought peace of mind through asceticism, and adopted Plato's Orphic theology, which was then passed on to Christianity. Meanwhile, Aristotle's sciences were inherited in Eastern countries that Alexander the Great conquered, and blossomed as Islamic culture. The Crusaders then brought these sciences back to Europe, leading to the Renaissance.
If so, his manuscript may still be hidden somewhere.
That's possible. However, not studying about him, but going beyond him, is more important.